Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Welcome to the Miller Center. Delightful evening outside. We're delighted that you're on the inside. I'm Jerry Bilals, Director and CEO of the Miller Center. It's my great pleasure to have you here this afternoon, this evening, for a very special program. As many of you know, the Miller Center has a focus on the American presidency, political history, and public policy issues of importance to the governance of the country. Our scholars' work with the history of the presidency includes the transcription and the annotation of thousands of hours of secret White House recordings made by 6 American presidents of both parties from 1940 until the Watergate proceedings in the early 1970s. Many of these tapes, we have found, reflect the myriad issues that Presidents Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon had to deal with in regard to the Vietnam War. Like some of you, not all of you, but some of you, I recall that period of time very well. And listening to the tapes has been a very enlightening experience because it illuminates, those tapes illuminate so much of what we remember that confronted the country at the time of great conflict. We're pleased to welcome Alvin Townley to recount the amazing story of 11 American POWs, whom the North Vietnamese had identified as their most uncooperative and subversive prisoners, captives. And we're honored to have Admiral Bob Shumaker with us tonight. He was a Navy pilot who was shot down in 1965 and held by the North Vietnamese for 8 years. His story is one of those featured in the book we'll hear discussed tonight, Defiant, written by Alvin Townley. There will be a book signing opportunity outside this room after the lecture. And after you hear the speaker, you will want to go out and buy dozens and dozens of copies for your friends and neighbors. To introduce the program, let me turn to a good friend of mine and supporter of the Miller Center, very formally known as John G. McFarland III. But John introduced the idea of tonight's program, and we've asked John to introduce his friend and the author, Alvin Townley, who is our speaker for this evening. John is a 1976 graduate of Hampton-Sydney College, a 1979 graduate of the Darden School here at the University of Virginia. After a successful 18-year career at Salomon Brothers, John, working alongside, I might add, Warren Buffett and other industry leaders, John became the chief operating officer and eventually vice chairman of Tudor Investments, one of the world's most successful hedge funds based in Greenwich, Connecticut. John recently founded and is current chairman of VZ Capital, a London-based firm that invests in emerging markets. John's father, Granger, is a longtime friend of mine, served as a member of the Senate of Virginia from 1984 to 1991, during which time I worked with him as Attorney General and Governor. John's wife, Dudley, is here tonight. We're pleased to have her with us. We appreciate the support of friends like the McFarlands, not only as supporters of the Miller Center, but as generous donors of thoughtful resources and presentations like the one we're about to hear tonight. John, please step forward.
Governor Bilals, thank you very much. It's and thank you to all of your colleagues at the Miller Center and to the supporters of the Miller Center for this opportunity. It's indeed an honor for me to be in the presence of one of our country's great heroes, General Shumaker, and I'm delighted to introduce Alvin, who's telling one of the stories that needs to be told, that hasn't been told enough, and I think that's the brilliance of his work, is that he has made it his writing career to find those stories about both our known and unknown heroes and tell them in a way that is extremely compelling. So I'm very fortunate to have met Alvin a number of years ago, before his writing career began, we were introduced by a mutual friend who knew that we were both Eagle Scouts and shared a love and commitment to scouting. And since then, I've watched with great amazement and enjoyment as he's dug up these both sung and unsung heroes and written very effectively about them. Among the known heroes are Michael Bloomberg and Ross Perot, Robert Gates. The unknown heroes are Peace Corps volunteers, young entrepreneurs in this country, and a POW who died in captivity while in Vietnam, Ron Stoltz. We're delighted to have Alvin here. He started his career in studying leadership as a young Boy Scout in Atlanta, Georgia, and both practiced and studied the attribute of leadership, I should say. From there, he went on to Washington Lee University. He worked on Capitol Hill, and then in the private sector. And then at some point, I'm not sure what the catalyst was, he found his true calling. He quit his job. He sold his house to fund his true love to write, and he began writing about American heroes. So our history as a nation and the spirit upon which it has been built is going to be and will be much richer for his books. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Alvin Townley, a great friend, and look forward to hearing his comments. Alvin, thank you very much for being here.
John, Governor, Nancy, thank you so much for having me. And as a Washington and Lee guy, and we refer to that as the University of Virginia sometimes. It's always great to be back in this area of Virginia, and particularly on a day like today, which is just gorgeous and makes me want to leave Atlanta all over again and come back to Virginia. It's a great state, and everyone's always warm here. So thank you for welcoming me to the Miller Center tonight. So this journey of mine really started, as John said, when I kind of took a leap and wanted to go tell the story of America's Eagle Scouts. And I'm an Eagle Scout, as John is. Anyone else in here? Excellent. We got a couple more book sales. I like that. You guys can come see me afterwards. But I wondered why it was that all these people, whether they were 30 years old or 100 years old, were always talking about scouting and the difference that scouting had made in their lives, and the difference that the values of scouting and the people that came out of scouting, what they had done to make America a little more American, a little better place. And so I set out to answer those questions, and as I did, I got to meet some amazing people along the way, just hear these stories I never would have heard otherwise. And there were stories I thought that needed to be told, and so the publisher up in New York, St. Martin's, thought that nobody's going to buy a book about scouting. Nobody cares about these kind of values. So they printed 5,000 copies. We went through 10 printings in the first year and sold over 100,000 copies, which shows that America believes in these values. And so as I was writing that book, I met a gentleman named George Coker, and he's the top bracelet up there. And I think they gave me a little pointer. I can point up there. Anyway. And as I was talking to him, he told me about being a POW in Vietnam. It was just this unbelievable story that I'd never heard. I consider myself well-educated. Those of you that went to UVA may disagree, or the Hampton-Sydney alums among us may disagree on that. But anyway, I thought I was pretty smart, and it's just a story that I didn't know. And I thought, well, if I don't know this, there are probably a lot of other people, particularly my generation, that don't know it, and there are also probably a lot of others that lived through it that needed to be reminded about it. And so I told the story in my first book. And then as I spent more time with Commander Coker, I heard him talk about a group of POWs known as the Alcatraz 11. And when I heard about the story of the Alcatraz 11, when I heard about the story of the values, the perseverance, and the character of these individuals, I realized I found my next book, and I found the next story that everyone in America needs to know and understand. So I want to take you on a little journey with me tonight, and I want you to imagine for a second that you are Lieutenant Commander Bob Shumaker. 30 years old, you're at the top of your class at the United States Naval Academy. So if you think that Washington and Lee guys are arrogant, talk to Admiral Shumaker. You are a finalist in the Apollo astronaut program. You fly the F-8 Crusader at twice the speed of sound. You take this thing, you strap this enormous engine, this enormous rocket. Everything you see behind his waist is engine. And you take this and you strap it on your back, and you think you're a good enough pilot to fly it off a boat, fly it around the air at twice the speed of sound, and come back and land it on that boat at night. You are, as far as you're concerned, the best fighter pilot in the entire world. You are confident, and you are completely in control of your environment and your aircraft and your life and your destiny as far as you know. And there's no way that anybody is going to bust that bubble of invincibility, and particularly not on February the 9th, 1965, when the U.S. was just starting air operations against North Vietnam. Certainly, you were never going to get shot down. You were always going to come home from your mission. This is Bob, February the 9th, 1965. This is Bob Shumaker, February the 11th, 1965. 2 days later, he was on a low-level run over a village in North Vietnam, around 1,000 feet. He was fine 1 second. The next second, smoke was in his cockpit. His plane was shuddering. Warning lights were going off. Klaxons were sounding. He started to make the Mayday call. He didn't even have time to make the Mayday call because he was about to go down. He had to pop out at under 1,000 feet, his chute open at 35 feet. And earlier tonight, John McFarland and I were talking about horseback riding, and John had gotten thrown off a horse. He can tell you that story later. But he said he was able to survive because he was able to roll and kind of disperse the force. And that's what Bob had learned to do in survival school, that when you land, you do a multi-point landing. Well, he bailed out so low and was coming down so fast, he had time for a one-point landing. It was right in his rear end. So he fractured his back, and there he was in a field in North Vietnam. All that ego had just taken a big hit. He no longer had his airplane. He didn't have his weapons. He didn't have a squadron backing him up. He didn't have a radio. He didn't have any communications at all. All he had left were his name, his honor, and his will to get home. And I hope I'm not going to steal too much of his material, but I got to tell you the first thing he thought about. Because I asked him, Admiral, what was the first thing you thought about when you were laying there on the ground in North Vietnam? Were you worried? He said, well, actually the first thing I thought about was this life insurance salesman that had come by my house the week before I deployed. I didn't buy any. And right there on the ground in North Vietnam, he wished he'd bought some more. And he knew that he was in for something unknown and something difficult, something that was going to require more courage and more character than anything he'd ever endured before. Because he knew he was going to have the strength, not just to get by, not just to endure this, not to just come out of this unbroken, but he needed the strength and character and moral courage to be defiant. But he didn't think he was going to have to be defiant for too long. Because again, the war was just getting started. This was 1965. He figured he'd be home by Christmas of 1965. The U.S. was going to make quick work of the communist forces in North Vietnam. Bob was getting out of there. He was there in 1966 at Christmas. He celebrated another Christmas. Another Christmas. Yet another Christmas. He has a wife and a young son who was 3 months old when he left. 1970, the U.S. starts withdrawing troops from North Vietnam. And every day, the North Vietnamese are telling all the POWs, see, we've been telling you for 6 years that your country's going to leave you here. And we were right. You're never going home. You're going to die here in these prisons. Bob and the POWs didn't come home for 8 years. Imagine that. 8 years of never knowing if you were ever going to come home. 8 years of being hungry, being cold, not communicating with your families, being in isolation, being beaten. 8 years. In 1965, These guys were wrestling champions. They were lead solo pilots for the U.S. Thunderbirds. They were aces from Korea. They were husbands. They were fathers. They were sons. And they all ended up in Wallow Prison, the Hanoi Hilton. And it was not like a Hilton hotel. This was built in the late 1800s by the French. It was a miserable, miserable place where thousands of North Vietnamese had been imprisoned during the colonial periods, and this is where the Americans ended up. And immediately, the Americans realized that they were going to be isolated because North Vietnamese knew that communicative prisoners were ones that would not cooperate. And some folks, including Bob Shumaker, realized they better come up with a way to communicate real quickly. I'll let Bob tell you more about the TAP code and how that came to be. But this grid was the spiritual sustenance of the American POWs. They communicated by tapping different combinations of taps to represent different letters. And this is how they communicated. This is how they held their little coalition together against the North Vietnamese. And the code of conduct was the other thing they had. Every American fighting man knew this code by heart. He knew that he was to do nothing disloyal or harmful to his country or his fellow servicemen or his fellow prisoners. And he was to give up nothing more than his name, rank, service number, and date of birth. Name, rank, service number, date of birth. Nothing else. And this is all protected, of course, by the Geneva Convention. But you see, North Vietnam had a particular point of view on the Geneva Convention. They decided that there was not a declared war that existed between the United States and North Vietnam. So it was their prerogative not to honor the Geneva Convention. So they basically just laughed at the US POWs when they said, stop, we don't have to tell you this because we're protected by the Geneva Convention. It's kind of like invoking, if you've seen Pirates of the Caribbean, it's kind of like invoking parlay. It didn't really work. But it wasn't bad, it wasn't too bad for the first couple weeks, couple months, because North Vietnamese didn't really do anything too difficult. They didn't really put too much duress on these POWs. But something finally happened in the late 1960s, we're not sure exactly what, and they started being a little more persuasive. So I want everybody to scoot up in your chair a little bit. Scoot up to the edge of your seat. And I'm going to show you a little bit how if you were Bob Shumaker, how your North Vietnamese interrogators, and Bob, you get a pass. You don't have to do this. How your North Vietnamese interrogators are going to get some information out of you. Now remember, you're a confident, almost arrogant, not quite, American aviator. You're competitive, and you're not going to let the North Vietnamese beat you, and you're not going to compromise your honor, because remember, that's all you have left. You don't have anything left. All you have is your honor, and you are trying to control the last little bit of your life you think you might be able to control. So you're not going to sign that confession that says you're a war criminal. So the Vietnamese put your hands in manacles, or put your wrists in manacles, not handcuffs, manacles, so they're tight together, and they put them behind your back. So everybody put your hands behind your back. Clasp your hands. And now you're going to get one more chance to sign that confession. Sign the confession. Come on. And you say, no, I'm not going to sign it. So you're already uncomfortable. And no one's elbows are touching in here, I don't think, right? So it's because Pig Eye hasn't showed up yet. So your interrogator, who's probably nicknamed Rabbit, maybe Cat, they had nicknames for all these guys, your interrogator calls in Pig Eye. Pig Eye shows up and brings some ropes with him. He's going to rope up your arms, and he's going to pull your elbows together. So your shoulders feel like they're about to pop out of their sockets, your sternum is about to crack, and you are in an incredible amount of pain. You had no idea that this kind of pain could be felt by a human being, but it is. And they ask you again, come on, Lieutenant, sign the confession. We're not going to tell anybody. It'll be our secret. Your country will never know. Your other POWs will never know. Just sign it. It'll be easy on you. We'll give you some food. We may let you go home early. You want to see your family again, don't you? Just sign the confession. But you know that sign the confession is going to compromise your code. You know that's not just a single event. That's a path they're trying to lead you down to be more and more submissive, more and more cooperative, more and more their agent. So you say, no, I'm not going to do it. So they take your arms and they jack them up over your head They drive your nose down to your knees are straight out on the floor, your legs are in irons, and you break. Because at some point, you guys can release now. Although, it's keeping everybody's attention, so maybe I should have you keep doing that. If you go to sleep, we'll do it again. But anyway, you break, and you think you're the only POW that broke. You thought for sure everyone else in that prison who got put through those ropes held out. You thought you were the only person that failed. So you went back to your cell that night. You might be crying. You're certainly broken. You think you're the only person. And you're alone in solitary confinement 7,000 miles away from home. And you don't know when you're ever going to get home. You might not even want to go home now because you think you're going to be so ashamed because you were the only one that failed. So you're back in your cell and your concrete slab trying to go to sleep, thinking you're terrible, and all of a sudden you hear somebody's tapping through the wall to you. One of your brother POWs knows what's going on, and he's sending you GBU, GBU, God bless you, God bless you, which meant a lot more than the literal. That was the most powerful term the POWs had, and it meant that I know what you've been through. It meant I understand, and it meant we're going to get through this together, and we're going to make it home. So the POWs came together around the idea of returning home with honor because in this new bizarre circumstance, the rules of war didn't apply. All their training, all their codes didn't matter anymore. They had to come up with their own code, their own vision of what their future looked like. And that future was returning home with honor. Commander Jim Stockdale, Commander Jeremiah Denton. I think most of you know that Jeremiah Denton passed away on Friday. And these two men were really responsible for leading 400 to 500 POWs home with honor. So they created this crystal clear image of where they wanted to take their men so that all the POWs could understand where it was they were trying to go. So if they were alone in a torture room, if they were alone in a cell, they knew how to act because they envisioned themselves returning home with honor, returning home, standing up tall in front of their families, in front of their countrymen, and most importantly, just looking at themselves in the mirror when they got home. So they could say that I did my best. I upheld my country's honor. So to keep all these POWs together, there was this network. The network had these two gentlemen as leaders. Bob Shumaker is one of the key people in this network. And this network was driving the North Vietnamese up the wall because they couldn't keep their prisoner in order. These 11 guys were ruining their entire re-education program. Some of the other guys, George McKnight, George Coker. One was a boxer from Oregon, one's a wrestler from New Jersey. These guys were mean as snakes and were absolutely combustible. And when the two of them got together, it was even worse. And these two guys, and one of the best side stories in the whole book, escape. And I'll let you read about that. It's an incredible story. And the truth was, the North Vietnamese for a while were probably glad they were gone. Harry Jenkins and Howie Rutledge. These two guys are the Orville and Hardy of the POWs. Harry Jenkins was 6'5", tall, gangly guy. They nicknamed him Ichabod Crane. He was the funniest POW in North Vietnam. These two guys became great friends. They were never more than 30 feet apart for 8 years. Never more than 30 feet apart. But they didn't see each other for 2.5 years. The first 2.5 years they were there, they were just taps through the walls or whispers under a door. There are now 7 POW grandchildren running around the United States because Jim Mulligan's son married Sam Johnson's daughter. And Admiral Shumaker and I will see Sam Johnson on Thursday in his office at the U.S. Capitol. He's a congressman from Texas. Ron Storrs, as John mentioned, one of the POWs did not come back. And when you read about the story of Ron Storrs, you're going to meet an amazing American patriot, and you're going to meet somebody who went the extra mile for his fellow POWs, but you're also going to meet somebody that shows you how horrible solitary confinement and some of the treatment the American POWs received was. Nels Tanner? Well, Nels was probably the last guy to get the sentence to Alcatraz, and the reason he got it was that he signed a confession that the North Vietnamese broadcast all over the world because they didn't realize that the commanding officer that Nels referred to was Clark Kent, and they didn't catch the joke. Somebody let him in on the joke later, and Nels, along with these 10 other guys, got sent to Alcatraz. And this is where the North Vietnamese sent their problem prisoners. In the middle of the screen, you can see comes some small white buildings, and there are 3 cells across the top of one, and then 9 cells down the bottom, 4 by 9 feet. For 2 years, the men at Alcatraz, Admiral Shumaker and the other guys, spent 23 hours and 50 minutes a day in a space this big. 1, 2, 3. 9 feet by 4 feet. Can you imagine that? 23 hours, 50 minutes a day. There are no windows. There's no breeze. It's cold in the winter. It's a furnace in the summertime. 2 years, never knowing how long you're going to be in that box. I'll let Bob tell you about some of the feats these guys had to concoct to get through that, to let their minds enable their bodies to survive what was almost worse than the torture. And for a while, these guys wanted to be tortured. Please, just give us some attention. Take us out of this box. Even if you're beating us, let us do something else and just sit here. Well, in 1969, they got their wish, and you can read about the Blue Book Purge of 1969. These guys may have stayed there forever if it weren't for their wives. This is the most important women's movement in American history, or one of, at least. We'll give it that. And nobody realizes it. Nobody knows it. Because the wives of these prisoners of war had to rally around their husbands to bring them home because the U.S. government was doing nothing. So the Miller Center talks about presidential studies and policy studies, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A, but the policy was to keep quiet. The official policy for the families and for the government was to keep quiet. Don't talk to the press. We don't want to endanger the prisoners. But the government said, we'll take care of it. Don't worry, women, we'll get your husbands home. After a couple years, they realized if they didn't do something, their husbands weren't coming home. So they started this movement that united America for the first time around the servicemen fighting the war. Because Vietnam was tremendously divisive, and for the first time, America needed to be reminded that whatever our opinions of a conflict may be, we need to support the men who are fighting it. And 5 million people wore these POW MIA bracelets. And these were worn by Cher, Bob Hope, and Richard Nixon. So people from every section of society were wearing these bracelets to remember the POWs. Sybil Stockdale, Jane Denton, and Louise Mulligan, 3 of the wives of the Alcatraz 11, were essentially 3 of the key founders of this movement. So from a standpoint of writing the book, I always thought the story was about the guys, about the men in the prison. But that's only half the story. The men in the prison, the POWs, were not the only people that were defiant. The wives were just as defiant as their husbands. So taken together, the men and the women involved in the book Defiant and the story of our POWs and MIAs are some of the most extraordinary people you will ever find in American history, because their battle went on for 8 years. 8 years of uncertainty, 8 years of torture, 8 years of anguish. And they all went through it, they all survived, they all persevered. And in February of 1973, after Bob Shumaker had been a POW for 8 years and 1 day, the POWs finally came home. And for America, it was really the end of the Vietnam War, because there had never been a particular point, a particular instance when the war ended. It just kind of faded away. It just disappeared. Veterans were never really thanked. There was no closure. Then the POWs came home. And they came home, and America was united, and for the first time welcomed servicemen and women home from the war in Vietnam. And it's important, as I talk about this, I want to make sure that everyone knows that all veterans share in this story, all POWs share in this story, because the values and the ethic and the character represented by these 11 POWs are the same things shared by all the POWs and every man and every woman that fought for their freedom and for their buddies in North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And this is what made it all worthwhile. Bob Shumaker thought about this for 8 years. That's his son, Grant. Grant's 8 years old. If you can see, he has his father's bracelet around one of his wrists. This is at Naval Air Station Miramar. And you know, I never thought one of my very good friends would be a former POW. But that's what's happened with Bob Shumaker. And I am absolutely honored and thrilled for you that he's joined us here tonight from Northern Virginia. Bob was one of the most quietly subversive POWs in North Vietnam. He's always very soft-spoken, so they always knew he was up to something, but they could never catch him because he's very clever. If you don't know that he's clever, he received a master's degree from Naval Postgraduate School, followed by a PhD from the Naval Postgraduate School, and had a distinguished naval career, retired as a Rear Admiral, has been a great friend to me, has represented the POWs extremely well, and is still a great pilot, as I can attest. And he's flipped me upside down more than once, and I've come home okay. And I want to just introduce to you my good friend and a wonderful American, Bob Shumaker.
Thank you very much. That's kind of you. I appreciate it. Now, how do we shut this thing off? Just punch the button? And, you know, authors are kind of strange. In order to write this book, I'm told, Alvin constructed it in his garage, a 4-foot by 9-foot cell, and locked himself inside. And he had his girl, by the way, he's due to be married in 25 days. But anyway, he had his fiancée feed him through a little slot hole, and he gave the key to a friend of his, but just so he didn't trust the friend, he kept the key hidden on inside. And so after a while, he got a little tired and stuff, so he decided to go for the spare key, and he reached out through to open the thing up. He discovered his friend, I guess he's still a friend, had switched the lock on him. And by the way, Alvin, it's a ship, not a boat. I have to correct you. Well, I hope this is more of a conversation than a speech. You know, it's not tightly structured here tonight. But, you know, the details, well, first of all, I was pretty much a technician. That is, I knew how to fly airplanes on and off aircraft carriers. But I soon learned that there's a lot more to warfare than just bombs and bullets. There's an economic side to it, a political side to it, and a psychological aspect. And that's what the Vietnamese exploited. They were much more sophisticated than we were and perhaps are in exploiting their POWs to become propaganda tools. By the way, none of these 11 guys that Alvin writes about has any financial interest in his book, but we were approached by Alvin, and we thought we were impressed by his research capability, and so we agreed to be interviewed by him. And with Admiral Denton's death last Friday, we're down to just 6 of these 11 remaining. But anyway, he's right in this little film here showing you think you're on top of the world, and the next minute, you know, you're down and with a broken back and facing, well, I noticed these Vietnamese were kind of barefooted and ragged clothes, but they had really expensive photographic equipment, like Leica cameras and things, which was my first inclination that they are tuned into the psychological and propaganda aspects of warfare. My back was hurting so badly that when they put me in front of a firing squad, I was kind of hoping they'd pull the trigger, you know, because I thought it would be just like going to the dentist, you know, it hurt for a little while. But fortunately, they didn't. And up to Hanoi I went. And I was there for about 3 months in a room that had a little wormhole through this wooden door. And I had a limited view of the courtyard. And after 3 months, I noticed that well, the guard would come every day to let me take my sanitation bucket off about 100 yards and dump it. But after 3 months, I saw there was a fellow that followed me. So I took a chance and wrote a note. Now, we didn't have pencil or paper. We had toilet paper, and someone had spilled some ink on the floor that I reconstituted. And I was trying to cheer this guy up by saying, welcome to the Hanoi Hilton. If you get this note, scratch your ear on the way back. Now, I've cleaned the story up a little bit for the present crowd here. But he was scratching away on the way back, and that's how the place got named, the Hanoi Hilton, which I think has turned into a museum now and into a kind of a resort hotel. But what they wanted was information. We were obliged as military people to give only 4 items of information that we call the Big Four. It's called the name, rank, serial number, and date of birth. And this went on for a long, long time. They keep hammering me about that. And they had Time Magazine and Washington Post and a lot of publications that had articles about my background. But so it seemed kind of ludicrous to me really to stick to the Big Four, but I did my best. And finally they asked this penetrating question. They wanted to know about my, well, first of all, I'll say my father was a Harvard-trained lawyer and, middle class, but, fairly successful. They wanted to know how many chickens he owned, because to them, that meant wealth. And so I didn't see any harm in telling him that he had 19 chickens. And, but I went back to my cell and I thought I had made a big mistake, because once you cross that line, then they'll keep pushing and pushing and pushing. So I made up my mind that they weren't going to get anything beyond that from me. And then I discovered that, you think that you can never be pushed to do things that you don't want to do, but pain is very persuasive. And Alvin described as what we call the rope trick. And to keep me from screaming, they ran an iron bar down my throat. And, I still have a little problem with that. But so I tried to commit suicide rather than go beyond what I'd given them. But they pulled me away from the wall. I was bashing my head against the wall. So it gets your attention fast. Well, let's see where we can go from here. Well, you're interested maybe in what we ate up there. We didn't eat very good food or nutritious food, and we knew that because if we would stand up from a sitting position, we'd start to black out because our heart wouldn't accommodate to the increased load. So, we learned to, hold on to something as we get up, and then pretty soon the dizziness would disappear. I remember in 1967 was a big year for American air raids over Vietnam, and you can imagine the noise of an airplane coming in, an afterburner, and bombs going off, and the Vietnamese shooting rockets and AAA at them. And as Alvin said, we weren't allowed to talk to each other at all. They had as many guards as they had prisoners to keep us from communicating with each other. And so right in the middle of this air raid, and we'd been on a monotonous diet for 6 months of cabbage soup, just a little leaf of cabbage floating around in a little broth or so. And I heard this American voice, and it was the first English or American voice I'd heard in a long time, and he was shouting. As if the American pilots could hear him. He was shouting, "Bomb the cabbage patches." So one of the things that gets you through, I hope this talk tonight isn't just about something that happened 50 years ago, and from an 80-year-old guy, because, I think the lessons that I learned, and perhaps you will too, is that there's a strong will in every one of us to survive. And I think, people that listen to us talk about our experience kind of wonder to themselves, well, do I have the guts to, survive in a situation like that? And let me assure you that you really do, because, you've been brought up with American values, with trust in a religion, and with the knowledge that democracy thrives in this country and that the free enterprise system is the best that the world's invented yet. And so let me assure you that indeed you would survive. And humor gets you through. The one fellow that didn't make it back and I would have breakfast every Sunday morning. Now there was a concrete wall that separated us, but we would tap, I'm sure all of you know this, and General Blouse would answer with 2 bits. And that would mean that there's an American on the other side. Then we start sending this code, and I'll send UVA. U in that box up there is in the 4th row and the 5th one, so it goes, sorry. But very, very softly, and that was a U. And V is V, and A is like that. We had little metal cups that we'd put against the wall, and that would amplify the sound because we'd have to keep our eyes looking for shadows as the guards would patrol outside and spring to the hatch that was located in our door. But we transmitted a lot of stuff that way, and we took Admiral Stockdale and I got interested in music. He played the piano and I played the guitar. And we decided Beethoven was all wrong with these sharps and flats stuff, that instead we ought to number the things. And there are 12 notes in our octaves. And we were interested, we were both engineers, interested in the frequency relationship of one note on, say, the piano to the preceding note. And it turns out from a mathematical point of view, it's called the 12th root of 2, which you could punch out on your computer in a couple of minutes, I think. But it took us 3 weeks to figure this out without pen or so it's amazing that when you're in a stressful situation, how your mind can work and how it can go back and recall facets of your life. I knew the names of people in my 1st grade and things like that. But we were determined that we were going to come back, and we were going to come back with honor. Let me tell you, I'm darting around here a little bit, but most of these guys were officers because they were pilots or crewmen of airplanes. But there was an enlisted guy there, and he was from Clark, South Dakota, and I don't think they even know how to spell Navy up there in North Dakota, or South Dakota. But he joined, he was a E1, which is the lowest enlisted rank, and they put him on, they sent him to a cruiser that was cruising one night off the coast of Vietnam, about 6 or 7 miles out. And he was assigned down in the engine room where it gets pretty hot, so he came up on deck to get some air about the time the Vietnamese started shooting at the ship. And the ship's captain cranked up the speed and was zigging and zagging, and Hegdahl, with the guy's name, Doug Hegdahl, zagged when he should have zigged, and over the side he goes, Well, the captain couldn't come back and get him. So he started swimming, and he swam for 6 miles, and now he had lost his duffel bag on his way over, so he was in civilian clothes, and when the Vietnamese got him, they were convinced he was a CIA agent. And, but what they didn't know was this guy had a photographic memory. And you see, the Vietnamese would, both sides in a war, I suppose, lie a lot about various things. But the Vietnamese would really lie a lot about how many airplanes they shot down. And now, if they released the name of every POW they got, then that would belie their statistics. So they would release only about 1 name out of 3. And so there were a lot of wives, that gave up the hope, I guess, and remarried. But we were very careful to make sure that we kept a careful count of all the POWs that were there. And every day we'd go over in our mind. That's another thing that you think sitting there you may not be able to memorize. But, you rip off a page or 2 out of the Charlottesville phone book, 500 names, and we could just spell those things right off. But the idea is if we ever escaped, we could get back and release these names. Well, there was a program the Vietnamese had. I'm doing on time. That we call the FINK program. And the FINK program was, they identified some POWs that were a little less than stiff-backed. And so they would work on them, and they had on 3 different occasions, they had a release program of 3 people each, so a total of 9. And on one of these release programs, there were 2 officers and Hegdahl, the seaman E1. And he didn't want to go, but the senior guy in his camp said, no, you have all this information, because he remembered not only all these names, but their hometowns, the next of kin, and even the telephone numbers of these things with his photographic memory. And so when he got back, all these 3 got their back pay, and the 2 officers went off with their wives vacationing. Hegdahl, he got his back pay too, but you can imagine it wasn't a whole lot of money. but with it, he bought a Greyhound ticket that took him all the way around the United States, stopping at each of these towns he memorized, called them all up. So it kind of restores your faith in these young kids. Well, let me think what might interest you here. Well, it came time for release. Oh, before then, we were in these cells, and for about 2.5 years, I think it was. And we did our best. We shared knowledge. The guy next to me was this congressman that's been a congressman for about 20 years, good Republican governor. And but he was a product of the Texas public school systems, and he never studied foreign language. Well, I had married a French Canadian, and I took French in college. So I would give him at his request 5 words of French a day, and then I'd have to amplify it with it rhymes with some English word, you know. Or sounds like it. So after, I'm hesitating whether to tell you the story because there's a crude part of it, and that is that at the end of 2 years, my vocabulary was getting kind of low. Well, if you recall, the French were in Vietnam for about 100 years and had a strong influence there. But the Vietnamese were trying to get rid of all the French literature, and one day, to my great delight, I found some slightly soiled pages out of a French book that had been used for toilet paper, and it extended my vocabulary for another couple months. But then there was a rescue attempt, a very famous rescue attempt called Sante Raid, and there was a famous Army colonel named Bull Simon who led this raid over there, and unfortunately, the Vietnamese had evacuated the camp just a week or so before. And even though it didn't result in any freed POWs, the Vietnamese got kind of scared, and they brought everybody back into into the Hanoi Hilton. And we were just so happy. You know, we talked for 3 days until our jawbones were sore. And every Saturday night, this was for the final 2 years, and Ho Chi Minh, their leader, had died, and with him went this torturing. So they weren't torturing anymore. But we'd have movies every Saturday night, but we didn't have projectors or films or screens or anything. What we had was John McCain, another Republican, who would come out in the middle of it, and it was a room about this size with 75 guys in it, and he'd sit in the middle and he'd tell us a story of a movie, sometimes taking longer than the movie actually took. And a year or so after I came back, I met with with Harry Jenkins, who was the real tall 6'6" guy, and we had agreed to have breakfast this one morning. And he came down. He was kind of bleary-eyed and irritable. And I said, "Well, what's the matter?" And he said, "Well, he hadn't been able to sleep the night before, so he turned the television on at 2 o'clock, and here was this movie that was playing." And it was one that McCain had told. Maybe you remember, The Quiet Man with John Wayne. Remember the Irish boxer? And I said, "Well, that explains why you're tired, but why you're so irritable." And he said, "It was nothing at all like McCain described." So, coming home was just really, really great. You know, my wife had shielded our son from, it was a living room war on television, so she didn't even have a television set in the house, and she kept him from that. The poor little guy had to learn to read early, so he went to Harvard and then Yale and then Dartmouth, and he's a brain surgeon today. So I hope you're storing up some questions here, because I think I'm getting the high sign that we've talked long enough here. And are you going to join me up here? Or? All right, please do.
All right. Bob Shumaker.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we want to spend a little time just doing some casual Q&A. Are we good up there with cameras? Good up there with cameras?
I think there's a plant in the audience here.
Okay. I did see a plant here.
Just to warm things up.
All right.
So, Admiral, obviously one of the key aspects or key tools in y'all's survival is, as Alvin described, as well described in the book, is the communication, the means of communication that you develop between your fellow prisoners. But you were really the first one, if I have the chronology correct, to start that process by scribbling on a piece of So what was it that you had been there for, what, 3 months, I think, by the time he arrived? You had to develop this connection. What was it that really kind of incented that and then kind of kept it going?
Well, I think
so just to repeat it back real quick. So the question is, how did the tap code really get started as the communication medium among the POWs?
Yeah, you know, I don't think we realize how communicative a society Americans exist in, because, you know, I'm sure each of us here in the audience read a newspaper today or listened to the TV or radio, and we're used to this stuff. And so it's really unnerving when you don't hear any outside information except the stuff they're feeding you. And I remember one time they told me, Shumaker, they could never pronounce my name right, we shot down 35 airplanes today, you know. And I said to myself, you got to be kidding me, you know. So I go back to my cell and there's nothing but 4 walls. And you start thinking, 35 airplanes, how in the world, you know, is that possible, you know? And so your mind plays tricks on you without anti-corroborating information. But anyway, they got crowded in this prison, and they brought in 3 other POWs into my cell, and I was the senior guy there. And I said, hey, look, it's obvious that what they want to do is divide and conquer, so we ought to come up with this idea of how to communicate. And this one guy, who's now a lawyer in Mississippi, said, well, you know, I was at a survival school, and not as part of the curriculum, but the instructor had been a POW. He was a sergeant in the Army. And someone asked him during a coffee break how they communicated. Well, my friend wasn't even part of the group. He was sipping his coffee on the side, but he happened to tune in. And he described this AFLQV code that was showing up on the screen there. And it really was the thing that countered all their propaganda. So it worked out pretty well for us.
I'm unbelievably fascinated by all of this. But the one question I have, just from the get-go, is how did you survive a broken back sitting in a prison without any attention? And how do you walk so well? And what did you do to get it fixed?
So Dudley's asking about Bob's broken back and how he kind of got through the situation with the medical conditions he had.
Hey, you know, that's another lesson I drew out of this experience, is that the human body is really resilient. And I couldn't sit up for about 6 months with this broken back, but it's just amazing how your body can kind of repair itself. I'm sure there are limits to this. If there's a physician in the audience that wants to counter this. But my wife had, just before I left, had given me a little pamphlet called the Canadian 5BX program, where it's an 11-minute program where you do some exercise, but you do a little warm-up thing. We're touching toes and bringing, but the cell wasn't big enough to do that, and so I, you know, improvised. And you know, after 6 months, I was able to walk around and stuff. And then about 2 years later, they put me in the ropes again. They wanted me to do participate in a propaganda film, and I refused to do it. And they put me into the ropes, and it was pretty grim. But I was kind of proud of myself because, you know, I bucked their demands. I had to crawl back to my cell. And about an hour later, they came to my cell, and here what they wanted was a wounded American in this movie, and I just done their makeup work for them, you know. So it was kind of grim. But does that kind of answer your question? Okay.
Sir in the back? You can use the mic there. It'll pick it up.
When the governor called and told me about this opportunity, I seized on it and tried to do a little research before coming here. Admiral, thank you for your service and courage.
Sure.
I wonder if I have one question for you and one question for Alvin, if I may. Question for you is, Admiral Stockdale was a bit of a philosopher. He believed in Stoicism. Epictetus, I think is how you pronounce the guy's name. I wonder how that Stoicism transmitted through you and your colleagues. And I'll come back to Alvin about a question for you.
Okay. Well, Admiral Stockdale and I roomed in a cell at one time for, I can't remember, maybe 6 months or a year maybe. It was 8 feet by 8 feet, and Sam Johnson and another guy were in there, 4 of us. And Stockdale, he's a graduate of the Naval Academy, or well, he's passed on, but in those days, the Naval Academy was strictly an engineering school. The only elective we had was a choice of foreign language. And in graduate school, he was at Stanford, and it was, I think, international affairs or something, a master's, and he had only one elective. And he happened to stroll by a guy named Philip Rhinelander, a professor there, and it was his first exposure to philosophy, and it just affected his whole life. And in later years, he became a scholar at the Hoover Institute, part of Stanford, and it really influenced him, and I think influenced all of us too, because he kind of was a prophet about it.
Thank you. Alvin, in terms of, you've done some hardcore research in terms of your garage. In terms of your other research, I wonder if you've read Jonathan Shea's Odysseus Homecoming, or what either of you think of.
My English professor is going to kill me. I have not read The Homecoming, no. I have read the book you have in your hand.
Honorbound, yeah.
Yes, sir, I have. There are a lot of great books out there, and actually I've learned about the Miller Center first from doing some research about Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson, and so I figured out what kind of wonderful resources you have here at the center, and it's just a great end of the circle, if there is an end of the circle, to be back here tonight.
Thank you.
Sure. Our Eagle Scout here, yes. Distinguished Eagle Scout.
Yes, sir.
Were you there when the B-52s came up?
You bet.
That had to have been wonderful.
So the question is about the Christmas bombing of 1972.
Right. And say what you will about President Nixon. He had the guts to at least send the B-52s over there. And by this time, I was living in a room, again, a little bit smaller than this, but we had quite a number of guys in it. And one of them happened to be a B-52 navigator, or had been earlier. And I noticed he took we had wooden frames for beds. He leaned it up against the wall and crawled underneath it. And I figured if he didn't have his faith in his fellow navigators, because they were using our prison as what they call an initial aiming point. So they went to a little bit to the west of Hanoi, and they dropped out this. It looks like tinfoil on a Christmas tree. We call it a window. And it flutters on down, and it confuses their radars. But it all fluttered into our prison, and then the bombs went off, and it was just wonderful music. Oh, and the ceiling started collapsing on us. Yes. Okay. You got me all excited, yeah.
I talked to one of the survivors of the bombing, and he said when they left to go get on the C-141s, that they went down a road. To the left was the rail yards. To the right were civilian houses. He says it was not a bomb on the civilian houses, but the rail yards were demolished.
Yeah, I can't attest to it. I didn't see I was just looking for an airplane to come on.
One of the navigators was Bus Mayle's son. Bus Mayle was one of the great coaches and football players here at the university. His son lives around. And he was one of the navigators. He described to us the trip over there.
Well, it would take a lot of courage on a B-52 crew's part to just, steady state, just fly straight and level and drop those bombs. They lost quite a number of them.
Yeah, they did.
Sir.
Admiral, I had a huge privilege of deer hunting here on my farm in Virginia with Neil Jones, and he probably, I had surgery at the time, so I didn't hunt with him, but he and Ken Lake, who was an Air Force pilot, American captain after that, still lives in this town, spent, I know it had to be a dozen hours or more around my kitchen table after they were hunting and talking. And my question, because I've heard stories, I just cannot believe, I do believe them, but it's just incomprehensible to understand. What I'd like to ask you is how you got these people to talk to you without intruding on their families' privacy and their dignity. I just cannot imagine how you earned their trust, and it really speaks well for you, sir, that they would talk to you.
Well, thank you very much. Bob was still, or Admiral Shumaker was still suspicious of me. That's why he hung me upside down in his airplane and made me promise to tell the story right. No, it all goes back. It all goes back to scouting, and George Coker was the gentleman I met when I wrote my first book, and I think that established a relationship between the two of us, and then he in turn I think called you, I think, didn't he, and said, "Hey, Alvin's thinking about writing this book, and you should meet with him and make up your own mind." And then I guess I had a sales job to do, but I think that just meeting one after the other and just showing them that I really wanted to tell their story. I didn't want to tell my story using them. I wanted to really tell what happened because I didn't need to make up anything. I mean, the story is so amazing as it is. And I think I tried to show that to the men and women who lived through it and their families, and just, I hope I did a good job in living up to what I promised I would do, because they have such an amazing story. And, I have such a personal relationship with all of them now that I want to make sure that I did my best to represent their best.
Did you show them a draft and give them a chance to say, gosh, I wish you wouldn't say that?
Yeah, I saw the draft, and I was impressed with some of his earlier writings. He gave me a book he hasn't talked about tonight called Flying Navy, and in his research, he'd been out on 3 aircraft carriers, and I read through this book kind of critically because that was my life for a long time, and I couldn't find anything in error in the book, so I was impressed with his research capability.
Yeah, I really learned that if you write about the Navy, they'll send you out to aircraft carriers. So yeah, I had a great time writing Fly Navy. That was a lot of fun. Sir. Thank you.
I had a fairly intense conversation last Christmas with my daughter, who's 40-something. And the question is, have you, Admiral, or any of the other 11 had any contact with Hanoi Jane?
No, we haven't, and I can only speak for myself. I haven't, nor would I want to. But the Vietnamese, we had loudspeakers in the ceilings of all these cells, and sometimes they would play those loudspeakers maybe 8 hours a day, and we'd hear Sweet Jane hour after hour after hour, and so we got a little sick of her.
And ma'am?
I mean Jane Fonda.
Yes. Yeah.
Ma'am?
Yes, this has been amazing. I've been to Vietnam a couple of times at the University of Virginia doing some medical things over there, and I'm curious, have you been back to Hanoi Hilton?
No, and I don't really care to. No.
I can understand. One of the things that struck me when we went through there, and as you say, it's now just a very small part of the prison that's still in existence. But they do have pictures up, for instance, showing the American soldiers at Christmas with these big grins on their faces.
Yeah.
Were you all made to sort of, I know you...
Well, no, I never was invited to any of those things, and I think I think it was
He was a bad apple, remember?
but I think it was a kind of a small group. They're very a person that's really skilled in propaganda can shine the camera just on a small segment, and make black seem white. But since you brought up the medical thing, after I'd been captured and I had this back problem, they used the phrase the lenient and humane treatment, which was anything but that. So they said, well, because of our lenient and humane treatment, we're going to take you to a hospital. So they put me back in my flying costume and got me in this blacked out Jeep and drove around in circles and finally stopped at what they claimed was a hospital. But they had 35 photographers there, and they stopped about a block short, so I had to walk there. And inside was this little table with a woman with a white frock on and a guy with a stethoscope, and all these photographers. And the woman spoke English, and she said, "What is the state of your father's health?" And I said, "Well, that's none of your business, And then this guy with the stethoscope came over and with great fanfare, put it on my chest without taking the coat off or anything, smiled at the camera. And then the English-speaking woman said, "The doctor said you will be feeling better in a few days," and I never got an aspirin out of them. So I hope they've improved their medical treatment.
Yeah, last night I was in Richmond with Paul and Phyllis Galani, who some of y'all may know, and just talk about the some of the things you saw in those rooms in the museum. And Paul very famously was beaten into doing a photo shoot, and they had him sitting in a nice clean cell with a nice bed with a nice mattress, and over him had these big words that said "clean and neat." And Paul, if you can see me, sat there just like this. And when Life magazine ran this on the front page, they photoshopped out his middle fingers. So his little nephew, for years, thought Uncle Paul's fingers had gotten cut off. But it's fascinating, though, if you go back, or if any of you do go over to Hanoi to go see Wallow Prison, you should. But the two rooms, or two rather small rooms, that are devoted to the American time over there. And those two rooms are rooms 18 and 19. And so if you have read Defiant, or when you do read Defiant, those are the two rooms where all the torture happened. So it's kind of ironic that the American exhibit are in the two rooms where some of the worst stuff happened.
And then this pretty little courtyard right outside.
Right, right.
That and the War Museum in Saigon also, I mean, just, because you understand it's obviously coming from their perspective, you know, but they've got, you know, all the pictures in there, and here are the American Marines going back to their helicopters with their heads hung in shame. And it's an interesting feeling to be looking at these exhibits while you're there with all the Vietnamese people who are looking at. I mean, we really didn't sense any.
Well, you know, this Miller Center is focused on policy, and you know, we got into a war. Ho Chi Minh, their leader, was clever, and you know, he was a born communist, but he made this thing into a nationalistic war, and so whether some individual peasant believed in communism or not, it was his land, you know. So, you know, maybe if we look in the future, we ought to be hesitant about getting into nationalistic wars.
And this may be a good time to wrap it up if you want. One of the interesting things to build on that, I was over there about a year and a half ago, and actually had tea at General how do you Zap?
Jap, the GIA.
I can never pronounce his name.
Yeah.
General Jap's house, who was the Vietnamese general that basically defeated the French and then led the war against the United States. And he was in the hospital at that point, but his wife was there, the Swiss ambassador, his son, and his grandson. And it was fascinating to be there and see the pictures of the general and Ho Chi Minh. And the next morning, his grandson and I, who are both in our 30s, went out and had breakfast together. And he picked me up at the hotel in his four-door Porsche, and we drove down these streets that had bicycles and mopeds and Porsches on them. And so Vietnam, I think, really is trying very hard to become a vibrant country. And the people that are in Vietnam that are my age, some of whom I'm very good friends with, they see the war as history. And it wasn't the war they fought, and it was a piece of history, and they're, I think, eager to join the world community and build a better life for themselves. So I think it's an interesting connection our two countries have, and it's one that I've been privileged to see there and experience in my own way through Admiral Shumaker and the POWs. So we'll be around for a little while, but thank you so much for your hospitality tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.